Namaste. My name is Nadine McNeil, and I'm super excited to be joining you here on Unwinding the Feminine Yoga for Stress and Anxiety. My contribution will be a conversation, one that is intended to provoke some thought into these practices, what we're practicing and why. To tell you a bit about me, I'm from Jamaica. I live in Bali. I've been here since 2015 on faculty at the Yoga Barn with my dear sister Bex, who just continues to rise from strength to strength. Prior to my deep dive into the world of yoga, I worked for the United Nations, primarily in the fields of emergency response and logistics. And this circuitous route is what brought yoga to me. As I was dealing with my own stress and anxiety, i.e. burnout, it was the practice of yoga, particularly breath, pranayama, that basically saved my life. So I'm going to use this as a segue into what I'd like to share today. And one of the things that has been coming up for me recently is the notion of impermanence. And when I say impermanence, the foundation of this is born from Buddhist philosophy and practices, essentially that nothing lasts forever. And ultimately, what impermanence invites us to look at is the notion of death, because as something dies, something else is reborn. This came to me this week when I recognized that I had been working myself into a frenzy about things that A, I had no control over, and B, had not yet come to fruition. And if nothing else, 2020 has been the PhD, the master lesson in learning to embrace change, as it were. And again, these practices, yoga, breath, movement, meditation, have certainly served me and others so well during this time. So I want to say a little bit about the practice of yoga and a yoga practice, because while they are related, they are two very different things. The practice of yoga examines the philosophy, the ancient wisdom behind this practice that has been passed down to us, so that we are now embodying these practices mainly in the area of asana in modern times. And then your yoga practice is how you activate the philosophies that you have learned. Recently on World Yoga Day, I was part of a panel discussion, and the aim of this panel discussion was to unpack where yoga is in modern times and how can we use this practice as a sustainable vehicle for change and transformation, with an emphasis on the Black Lives Matter movement. This is what the panel discussion was about. So I'm going to take you back and take you forward a bit. I first started to practice yoga around 2001. I had no idea what I was getting into at the time. We enter the path of yoga through different routes. Mine came from a largely physical route. I'd always been very active at the gym, ran half marathons, etc. And then I got to a stage in my physical life where I felt I wanted more. Around the same time, a love relationship unraveled, heart wide open. And so I took my grief, my hurt, my wounds of betrayal and abandonment to the mat. And so the more I practiced yoga, the more I discovered about myself. limiting beliefs that I had been running around with that no longer served where I was going, unconscious beliefs, things that I didn't even realize were affecting how I was showing up in life. Coming from a largely Christian background, I was taught and brought up to do unto others as I'd have them do unto me, be a good girl, and all will be well. Anyway, I got to about my mid-30s and realized that while that package or that guidance had served me for where I was going next, I needed to change the package up a bit. So the practice of yoga deepened as I continued my work in the UN, working in Africa, working here in Southeast Asia, working in Haiti. The practice deepened, and I recognized for me to take this where I wanted to go next, I would have to surrender to the yoga. So that's what I did. I know many of us have heard this story. We've left our corporate jobs to pursue, the soul quest, the spirit quest, as it were. And what a journey that has been. And so as I continue to both teach and practice yoga, I encounter souls just like me from all across the world that are really looking inward and looking at, why am I here? What am I meant to be doing? How do I serve the greater good? And a large part of this program and what's being offered here by an extraordinary faculty, as well as you who have shown up to be a part of this, is this soul's quest, the spirit quest, as it were. So I come back to where we are now, first looking at the pandemic and how that has shifted our lives, and then the human issues that are happening around that. And very early on in Corona, I recognized that what the invitation of this pandemic really is, or was, is to reconnect with ourselves, to start to take really good care of ourselves at every level, mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and otherwise. And so if we've been practicing this yoga and we've experienced these individual shifts and transformation, how can we then collectively ripple this out into the world? Yoga is not just about the asana. That is just an aspect of it. And I certainly feel that one of the things that have happened in the practice over the years is that there's been an over-reliance or dependency on the physical components while compromising the equally, if not more valuable aspects of the meditation, the self-inquiry and such. I remember when I did my first yoga teacher training in India, one of the things that really struck me then in that ashram was the fact that yoga is a viable tool for peace. Can we have peace in the world? Yes and no. World peace may not be attainable, but what is certainly attainable is inner peace. And from that place, all things flow. So then one might question, well, how have we arrived at the place that we are now? It's not surprising. We have been on a fast track trajectory. We live in a world where we want everything overnight: fast food, fast sex, fast work, fast internet speed. And so while we've been like battery hens moving and moving and moving, there's been a disconnection from the temple that is the body and a disconnection from source. And the greatest opportunity this pandemic gifted us with was that of slowing down. We were forced to sit down, shut up, and look at ourselves. And for some of us, that is incredibly terrifying. And it is in that process that perhaps many of us started to see, hang on a minute, what have I been doing? I've been engaged in work that doesn't feed my heart. I've been in relationships that I might not necessarily be happy with. I've made some choices that I now want to look at and go, do I want to continue to invest in these choices? Yoga gives us the perfect container where we can look at all of this. And so, as we started to look at Black Lives Matter specifically, because that was sort of what lit the flame, and then we started to look at differences in ethnicity, culture, gender. We began to see that perhaps some of what we've been saying is not exactly what we want to say. When I first started practicing yoga, there were very few people of color, particularly women, showing up in studios. And I noted this, I acknowledged this, I didn't feel out of place. Much of my work and life have been in places where I was the sole person of color there. So that became quite comfortable, uncomfortable for me. And then I remember saying, well, if we say that the meaning of yoga is to yoke or unite, then yoga is the one place where we can actually come together, feeling safe together, coming into a place of vulnerability and sharing where we're at. In principle, the reality rolled out to be something a little bit different, you know? We're moving fast, we come into a studio, we roll our mats out, we do our practices, and then we leave. So the sangha, the community aspect of the practice is or was largely missing. The issue of gender, of us being women, womb men, creatrixes, givers of life, is an incomplete discussion unless it acknowledges, celebrates, and respects our differences. I certainly feel that one of the mistakes that we've made as humanity is saying that we're all equal. I don't believe we're all equal. I know that we are different. And I know that in our difference, we create this rich melange, which is even greater than our single mere mortal self. If we're able to do this, then what we do is that we reduce the separation that comes as a result of trying to make us equal and the same. It's kind of paradoxical because we want to say we're all the same, but we're not. And in acknowledging that, I can then see you. You know, one of the discussions that we often hear, or I've often heard, is when someone says it with regards to race or ethnicity, something like, I don't see color. If you have two eyes and you can see, you are aware of the fact, excuse me, that I may look different from you. There is nothing wrong in acknowledging that difference. What happens when we say something like we don't see color is, it is a failed attempt to make someone feel safe, certainly isn't me. And then what it also does is that it renders a huge part of who I am invisible. because the reality is we do not live in a homogeneous world. We live in a beautifully textured world where that's what we want to celebrate. So one of the ways that I've been looking at contributing to shifting the dynamic around separation, diversity, ethnicity is looking at the language that I use. I grew up in Jamaica until I was 16 years old. And then when I left Jamaica, I then went to live in Canada. And many people of color have had this experience. This is not unique to me. Arriving in Canada, I went to a girls' school, a Catholic school, a virtually all-white school. It was a private school. I think there were 400 students. There were 3 of us who were Black. And I would get asked questions like, do you live in a grass hut? Do you wear grass skirts? I mean, literally, in the early 80s, I was being asked these questions. More than interpreting them as being racial and racist, I saw them as ignorance. And then looking back, what I recognized is many of these people actually hadn't traveled. Travel is a lot different today than it was then. So whatever impressions or interpretations that were being formed about people of color came from the few programs we could see on television and what we'd read in history books. A few weeks ago, I was invited to speak at a home school here in Bali. The children were ages 9 to 12, and I was invited to come and speak on the issue of Black Lives Matter. And I had prepared this wonderful presentation. You know, I wanted to talk to the kids about how the world was formed and Christopher Columbus, and sort of enter the conversation through there. No sooner had I arrived and had children, these beautiful children from all around the world sat in a circle around me. You know, we had representation from Russia, from Norway, from France, from Spain, from Italy, from the Netherlands, from Australia. The children started to come with questions. And one of the first questions I got came from a little girl from Spain. And she said to me, why didn't the white people like the Black people, and the Black people were stronger than the white people? So I said to her, well, where did you learn this? And she said, well, this is what her parents told her. And I went, wow, okay. So on the one hand, I'm deeply grateful that I'm not a parent in this day and age, because these children are asking informed and intelligent questions. And so our discussion continued. So in that moment, I became aware of the fact that I am a catalyst for change, because whatever I share with these children is going to have a lasting impact on their lives. 80% of who we are is formed somewhere between the ages of, let us say, 5 and 18 years old. We know this because much of the work that we're doing to unlearn, to relearn, is as a result of what we were taught in those times. And so when I went to school in Jamaica growing up, the history that was passed down to me was, you know, was about Christopher Columbus and was about British colonialism and about Jamaica, you know, gaining independence in 1962. I knew of the existence of slavery, but I wasn't educated in the abhorrence of it. And I would imagine that there was justifiable reason for this. There's a tremendous amount of shame on all sides of the equation that is attached to slavery. And so this is a discussion that no one really wants to have. There's also a certain degree of trauma, a large degree of trauma that is still running in that slavery dynamic. So it wasn't until I went to live in New York City in my early 20s that I really began to study, appreciate, and understand Black history, as it were. It was in those days that I started to read the likes of James Baldwin, Miriam Makeba, Alice Walker, Maya Angelou, Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon. I really started to dive into this work, and I was absolutely blown away. The music that I listened to, the likes of John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Alice Coltrane, Joe Sample, all of this was new for me because that was not what I was exposed to growing up. And so I share all of this to say, it was somewhere between the ages of, let us say, 16 and 20, 21, 22, that I really started to get a glimpse of the far-reaching implications of racialism, as it were. It's not that it didn't exist in Jamaica. What we did in Jamaica was we masked it. We covered it under the guise of classism. Oh, Jamaicans are not color prejudice, we're class prejudice. You know, how can we have a country that's 95% Black and still there is prejudice? And the reality is, it existed and it exists because the economic wealth of Jamaica lies in about 5% of the population, and that population is largely white. And so I want to pause here for a moment and touch on the economic consequences of the discussions that we're having now. I was in my early 30s when I understood that the slave trade did not end for humanitarian reasons. It ended for economic ones. Sit with that for a moment. The slave trade ended for economic reasons, not humanitarian ones. Because the slave owners recognized that by paying the slaves, they would become more productive. Even though they were paid, invariably the money came back to the slave owners because it was in their establishments that the slaves then spent the little money they earned. Also, they were still living on the plantation and so had to contribute to their keep. I had a discussion recently with a financial analyst, a woman, biracial, and it was very enlightening and confronting. And one of the things she said to me is, why do we think that this issue of color has become so pronounced in these times? Now, we know that racism and racialism has existed ad nauseum. So why would it come up now? What was so poignant about the George Floyd scenario and all of those? And one of the things she said was that because of the unresolved trauma that people of color in the United States carry, the easiest way to provoke an issue and disempower someone is actually around race. And I went, whoa. And the intersectionality now of the pandemic and this race. We've heard the people that are most affected by the virus are those from the African American communities. Now, there's an interconnectedness in all things. And one of the things that we also know is that many of these communities live in urban enclaves where access to healthy food is limited, economic resources are limited, so their bodies are not healthy. So with a compromised immune system, they are the ones that are most likely to be impacted by this virus. Also, when we talk about frontline workers, the frontline workers in this pandemic are people in supermarkets, people in public transportation, the sanitary workers, etc. And most of those people happen to be people of color. So when we're being given information, particularly these statistics and these glaring statements, we need to look at them and unpack them one level further to understand actually what is being said. I had a discussion recently with a teacher, a fellow teacher, who made the comment that, well, it's not a comment, it's a fact, that the average American living in the United States has probably gained about 15 pounds during this coronavirus time. And when he said it, I smiled wryly because here we go again, the discrimination, as it were, of this pandemic. Because while we have one set of people gaining weight, there's a huge majority of humanity on this planet who are at the threat of either starvation or malnutrition. You know, for example, in a place like South Africa and elsewhere, that there were food programs in schools. Once these places went into lockdown, for many of these children, the one healthy meal that they were guaranteed, they no longer had access to. So, you know, while we might certainly be in the same storm, we are not in the same boat. And so, as we're discussing differences and discrimination, the virus itself has been discriminatory, both on the up and the down. What do I mean by up and down? Both on a positive dimension and on a negative dimension. If we look at the countries that have fared well, that have managed this pandemic best, it has been nations that have been led by women. One may question why. Women have a very different approach to leadership than men do. And I recently read a Forbes article about this. And one of the things that it said that really struck me was, women are comfortable, and this is going to sound like a mass generalization, but bear with me. We are generally more comfortable with showing up and saying, I don't know. I don't know, but I'm prepared to figure it out. I'm prepared to drop into my vulnerability. I'm willing to ask for help. And I'm willing to do something that will ultimately serve the greater good. So there's been a lot of feminine creativity, as it were, in how this virus has been handled in these areas. So I know I've covered a lot of interconnected parts, and I hope that you're staying with me here. So coming back to how can we build harmony amongst ourselves? It is important that we look at the stories that we're telling ourselves as well as the languaging that we're using. I'm still on the financial bit. So one of the elements of the slave trade that has been so abhorrent is this business of the slave being considered less than human. And if we look at power over within this context, there is no way one human being could treat another human being in the manner in which the slave trade existed unless the one with the perceived power made the one who was being powered over less than. To simplify what I'm saying is your conscience wouldn't allow it. If I saw you as you saw me, there is absolutely no way I could strip you naked, strip you from your families, separate you from your tribes, and pack you like sardines in boats and put you on perilous waters all over the world to serve your greater good, your economic good. It wouldn't be possible. And so these times that we're living in, sisters, is really an opportunity for us to come here. You know, one of the things I've witnessed, both as a coach, a teacher, facilitator, space holder during this time, is a justifiable amount of anger. The emotion of anger is a hard one for us to hold as women because of the conditioning. Little girls mustn't get angry, speak when you're spoken to, be ladylike, and all of that crap. If you're a Black woman, then there's the added component of being the angry Black woman. And I used to run away from that title. It's like, oh my God, I don't want to be labeled as the angry Black woman. But you know what? I'm embracing that because my anger is the fuel that catalyzes, that transforms. It's what allows me to recognize the injustice in something and to get off my posterior and do something about it. Being of African descent, I am essentially just a boat ride away from being here and being able to share this with you. The weight of my blessings is what behooves me to show up and be a better imperfect human being in the world so that I can love and lead by example, so that if one of you are impacted, then you can ripple that out to maybe one other person and so on. You know, there's oftentimes we feel, well, what can I do? These problems are so great. You can do a lot. You do a lot by, you know, opening the eyes and looking within. Are you satisfied with the life that you're living? And if you're not, then welcome to the world of transformation and change. Bex and I have had numerous animated conversations on the topic and the issues surrounding race. And one of the things we've spoken about is permission. What do I mean by permission? So there are some things that as a Black woman, I can say that are acceptable or tolerated. I don't know how much they're acceptable, but they're certainly tolerated or not argued with, that someone who is not Black cannot say or is not given the permission to say with much authority. And my feeling is that rather than argue that, let us accept our role in the conversation of humanity transforming itself and playing that necessary part. So as a Black woman, there's a certain conversation that I can bring to the table. And particularly for my Caucasian sisters, the shift that we're looking for actually is with you. It is in your hands. Some of us might be saying, well, why me? So let us take a word, for example, like privilege. White privilege. What does this really mean? When we have been granted privilege, by virtue of that privilege, it propels us into action. So to enjoy privilege, it is not enough just to sit with the fact, well, I'm treated differently because I'm white, and therefore I'm just going to rest on the laurels of my privilege. That's actually not privilege. That's entitlement. The privilege aspect, which is a gift, is going, okay, I have this advantage. I have this opportunity. How do I play this forward to make the world a better place? There's been a lot of discussion about white fragility. And when I heard the statement initially, white fragility, or the phrase, something about it didn't really resonate with me. But I acknowledged it and I kept it moving, you know, because also one of the things that we must recognize is none of us have the answers. We're all trying to figure this out on all sides of the equation, pardon me, it doesn't matter where we're from. We're all waking up. We're all removing these rose-colored lenses to the fact that a lot of what we've been programmed with have in essence been lies. So we're, you know, it's like we've emptied our purses or our handbags or a basket, thrown it out, and now we're trying to take out the pieces that we need and throw away the trash and the stuff that we don't actually need. And so the term white fragility is intended to contextualize a starting point for a dialogue. The challenge, however, is that the term in and of itself smacks of racialism in an almost passive-aggressive way. How can you have privilege and fragility at the same time? Is fragility exclusive to whites? Can I have fragility? One of the things I remembered, some of you might be aware of this, the bird watcher case in Central Park a few months ago, is following that there had been a quiet demonstration in Central Park led by an African-American man. And one of the things he spoke of, highly emotional at the time, is he has never been given the space or the permission to express his emotions with regards to race. And I can relate to that. I mean, throughout my life, I've had innumerous overt as well as covert racial situations where I've kind of had to chin up, bottling those emotions and keep it moving. What would happen if I were to be fragile and burst into tears at every instance that I came across some sort of racialism? Some might consider me a basket case. The thing is, the overt racism is easy to spot. It's the subliminal, it's the one that we don't quite see. You know, for example, having an incident occur and you share it with a friend, someone that you feel you can trust, and they go, really? Maybe that didn't really happen, Nadine. Maybe there's a different way of looking at this. So you've been twice invalidated. You've been invalidated in the situation, and then when you go to seek support and courage, you're further invalidated. So the terms that we're using to unpack this, we really have to examine what these terms mean. The other term that's, you know, being tossed around, the term of allies. And I've had some resistance to that. Again, I understand the intention behind it. But when I think of the term ally, what it brings up for me is war. And I suppose one might say or argue, we are living through varying degrees of wars without it actually being called such. But what resonates more for me is solidarity, sister solidarity, human solidarity. How can we stand shoulder to shoulder in the world in which we are now living and transform these various issues? We're in the middle of July, almost moving towards August, and you know, we're moving back to our lives in varying degrees. Countries, for example, in Europe, some of them never closed, some of them have reopened. Australia, there are varying degrees of how the pandemic is unfolding there. The United States, we're watching figures increase daily. Here in Asia, we're hearing varying degrees of stories and, you know, how the numbers are rising. And then, of course, we still have this overlay of discrimination. And one of my fears has been, how do we continue to keep the momentum, to keep the dialogue, to keep the conversation going so that we can actually realize a change? I believe that this is the closest we've ever come to it. And, you know, I've heard a couple of people say, oh, we have no leaders, we have no mentors, they've all died, they've all passed on. Well, consider this. Consider stepping into your leadership. Consider stepping into your mentorship or your sistership, as it were, because we are the change that we're waiting for. You know, so whatever the issue is that ignites you, whatever the cause is that you choose to stand behind, whether it's around race, whether it's around sex slavery, whether it's around domestic abuse, psychological abuse, trauma, mental health. The practice of yoga certainly becomes a gateway for us as we embody our practices. And again, let me unpack that word embody, because it's one of these that we throw around as well. The body keeps the score. When I talk about embodiment, what I'm talking about is our divine natural ability, our DNA, taking in whatever it is into every fiber of our being and feeling it, so that in the embodiment of love, in the embodiment of truth, in the embodiment of peace, I show up from that place and I serve wholly and completely. As studios are starting to reopen around the world, I've even had this experience here in Bali. One of the things I've said to myself is, well, how do I show up and teach, you know? Is it enough for me to just roll up to class, rock out my mat, and go through an asana practice? Thankfully, I've always been a very integrated teacher, but here I have a real platform and space to be a vehicle for change, change of myself, as well as change of others. So my invitation to you, sisters, during this time is to dare to get uncomfortable with yourselves. Particularly in this program that's being offered, it is the perfect container to know that you will be supported and that this can occur without judgment. Now more than ever moving forward, the world requires that we are doing our inner work so that we can show up fully to hold space for those who may not have a voice, for those who are marginalized, for those who are unable to hold spaces for themselves. When I think of my mantra, transforming lives one breath at a time, breath is life. Everything begins with the breath. And it's incredible how we've come full circle, or actually, I retract that because we haven't come full circle. We are in a circle or in a spiral or a circuitry that's all about the breath. The pandemic, as it were, certainly in the early stages, the aspect of the physical body that it most threatened was our respiratory system. And one of the recurring themes we've seen in these racial atrocities is the ability to breathe. So often we're hearing, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. Yet we can breathe. And so breath is life. And so while we still have breath in the physical body, as it were, let us optimize that breath. Let us oxygenate our cells so that we can embody our mission and our purpose and go out in the world and share that. I hope what I've shared with you today is of value. You may learn more about me and my work by visiting my website, universalempress.com. I'm also available on Instagram under the same handle, universalempress.com. I will also share in our group an article I've written recently. It's available on Medium about the practice of yoga versus a yoga practice. Enjoy the rest of your program. I look forward to hearing from you. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. My name is Nadine McNeil, Universal Empress, transforming lives one breath at a time. Namaste.